series, I'm going to present the most important philosophy books that have been written according to a survey done among professional philosophers a few years back. What I'm going to do is I'm going to present the work in its context, a little bit about the author, point out some of the highlights of the book, and try and figure out why it's so important and why maybe read it today. Today I'm going to talk about Discipline and Punish by the French philosopher Michel Foucault. Foucault was born in France in 1926. He was a university teacher for most of his life, among other places at the Collège de France and at Paris 8, the university that was founded after the student movements of 1968. Foucault was often associated with structuralism, but he himself distanced himself from that movement. And he died in 1984, actually pretty young, one of the first victims of the then very new AIDS virus. About Discipline and Punish, it was published in 1975. So if we look at Foucault's body of work, one central question that's always on his mind is, how do human beings become subjects? In the first period of his work, of his life, he focuses on psychiatry and sciences, life sciences, wondering how do the sciences that we produce actually produce the types of subjects that we are. In a second period in his work, he focuses on the power relations that produce those subjects. And in a third period and final period of his body of work, he focuses rather on the subject itself. How do we ourselves make subjects of ourselves? And Discipline and Punish, published in 1975, is basically at the end of that second period, focusing on the power relations. The first thing to notice about Discipline and Punish, and about a lot of work from Foucault, is that it's a fun read. The book straight away opens up with a graphic description of an execution in 1757 of a person called Damien the Regicide, someone who attempted to kill the king. And we're presented with a very vivid description of a person whose flesh is torn from his limbs, his right hand with which he attempted to kill the king is burned, the wounds are filled with molten lead, the body is quartered and then burned. And this is opposed or contrasted with a detailed description of prisoner life in Paris some 80 years later. So the central question Foucault is looking to answer in this research is, how do we go through this process of humanization of the treatment of criminals? And humanization, we can put it in brackets, because not only is it a way of becoming more humane, but it's also a process of human making, where we're looking at how humans are made. The focus is changing from one on the crime to order in the society, to managing people. And so torture and corporal punishment are abandoned, and the body is no longer used as an object of torture, but instead we go to a process of disciplining not only prisoners and criminals, but finally also soldiers and students and any body of population, any group of people that we can subject to elaborate systems of rules and regulations. The model that Foucault uses to illustrate his point is what he calls the panopticon, or what actually Jeremy Bentham invented as such, which was a model for a prison. In that model, each cell would be isolated, and each cell isolated would be placed around a central tower. And from that tower, one person or one guard can actually see through each cell and observe each prisoner individually. That central tower would be potentially equipped with tinted windows, so that the prisoners, each and every one of them, wouldn't know if they're being watched or not. What that shows us, according to Foucault, is how power actually functions. What happens is, all those prisoners will internalize the feeling of being controlled. They will end up disciplining themselves. So in the end, there's actually no need for a central point of power. That power is exercised by each and every member of that little society of the prison. So that model of the prison, of the panopticon prison, is extended to society as a whole. What we see is actually that society as we know it, modern society, divides and individualizes its members. And each member internalizes those functionings of discipline, of power, in order to try and be the model citizen they can be. The result is what we can call a disciplinary society. The panopticon is a model for not only an exclusion of delinquents, and of course their re-education and their subjectivation, to an inclusion of everyone. All bodies, all citizens become subjects of that discipline. This is what Foucault calls subjectivation. So it's proper to a panoptic society that each and every individual life is controlled, disciplined into its very most minute details on a micro level. And on the other end, that this control through discipline, is extended into all spheres of the political body. So it's both micro level and all inclusive. Foucault's analysis obviously has consequences for how we think about prisons in themselves. The criticism we have of prisons is as old as the prisons themselves, that they produce the delinquents that we're trying to reduce. The only possible reaction from that same prison system is to increase its system of correction, classification, re-education, investigation, and subjectivation. The aim of prisons is to discipline its delinquents, to observe and analyze, to manipulate them, and finally to subject them, to make subjects out of them. So we go from a negative minimum of do not commit crimes to actually a positive maximum of be disciplined. And this covers all aspects of human acting, human thinking, human wishing. So Foucault's main argument is a critique, a criticism of the being of the subject. This is what makes him a postmodern thinker. To Foucault, the human being is not a fixed being. It's not something transcendental or ontologically determined. What we are is rather a result of historical processes. Foucault's central concept in understanding that historical process through which subjects are made is that of power. So power, it refers to something that is not transcendent, but rather something immanent to all behavior and all manipulation and all interaction of human beings among each other. It's something that is not exclusive, like prisoners who used to be excluded from a society, but rather inclusive. We are all, as human beings, part of this disciplining functioning of power. So power is basically one single name for a multiplicity of relations and influence. And ultimately, what we call resistance is actually a part of power. It is the engine propelling the functioning of power. For example, the prison, it is actually that intensification around delinquents, around people who are not sufficiently disciplined, to grab them again and intensify that process of power through which we can discipline them. And the result is what Foucault will call subjectivation, a sort of passive molding of human beings into good subjects. So how should we read Foucault? He's been criticized a lot for his historical inaccuracies, not only in Discipline and Punish, but in other works as well. But to this, with Foucault, we could reply that his work has actually a double intention. There is the descriptive part of showing us how prison practices have appeared and changed throughout time, but there's also a critical element of showing us how punishment practices of criminals have over time widened towards a disciplining practice of delinquents, and ultimately any member of society. So ultimately it shows us the functioning not only of discipline of delinquents, but also soldiers, students, employees at factories, and citizens in general. We are all the disciplined in this society. Another difficulty with reading Foucault is that he does not present grand philosophical theories. Rather, what he does is he studies specific cases. Like in Discipline and Punish, he will focus almost exclusively on the prison system. Because the human condition is not something that is a general given, but it is actually a particular case and a historic contingency. So an implicit point of Discipline and Punish is that the present is actually a result of the past, and that past is actually something contingent. That is to say, it is open to interpretations. And as a result of that, the present is also contingent. It is dependent on history and on the interpretations of that history that we make. So how is Discipline and Punish by Michel Foucault relevant today? Well, on one hand, it shows us how a state system manages and disciplines us as citizens, as human beings. But also, and more so, it shows us how we actually manage and discipline ourselves. How it's not so much a state or government or centralized government that disciplines us, how it is something that emerges from the power relations that surround us and to which we contribute ourselves as subjects. So in conclusion, if the subject is historically determined, then the subject can be something else in the future. And so Foucault's analysis of power is actually a plea for finding spaces of freedom, of indeterminacy. To become aware of why we are who we are is what makes it possible to try to be someone else in the future.